see if Mr. Kern's working on this.
Mr. Kern doing the second one?
Yes. Well, I'll do the script part of it, but he's on the loop.
Okay. We ready? We're on? All right, just for the record, before we start, there's obviously a bunch of media in here. Grand jury proceedings are sealed until they're not. You guys don't have a problem with media being here?
No, I believe this is a public proceeding.
Okay. All right, let's get going. Are there any matters to be presented from the grand jury?
Yes, Your Honor. Over the last several months, the grand jury has met, and yesterday in grand jury case number 22 CGJ 117X by a vote of 12 or more grand jurors, they have indicted Dwayne Keith Davis, aka Keefy D, on one count of murder with use of a deadly weapon and with the intent to promote, further, or assist a criminal gang. The indictment is signed by myself, as well as the foreperson of the grand jury.
Thank you. Ms. Foreperson, did at least 12 members of the grand jury concur in finding a true bill on each count as to this defendant charged in the indictment?
Yes, we did, Your Honor.
Thank you. The indictment will be filed. Receive case number C-23-377407-1. Will be assigned to department number 10. What's the state's position as to warrant or summons?
Warrant, Your Honor. Mr. Davis is actually currently in police custody. He was, as of this morning, taken into custody on probable cause. As a history of what the factual scenario here is, this case actually stems from an event that occurred on September 7th of 1996. Prior to that time period, there was a record label by the name of Death Row Records that was headed up by an individual by the name of Marion Shug Knight. Mr. Knight associated closely with gang members out of Compton by the name of the Mob Piru. They were Bloodset. One of his star artists was an individual by the name of Tupac Shakur. The Mob Piru had a natural competition or were in disputes with another gang in Compton by the name of the Southside Compton Crips. And by mid-September or mid-1996, there wasn't much of a distinction between Mob Piru and Death Row Records. Shortly before September of 1996, there was an incident in which some Southside Crips and some Mob Piru gang members got into a physical fight, and during that fight, which on the South Side involved Orlando Anderson, and on the Mob Piru side involved an individual by the name of Trayvon Lane, there was an effort to steal a Death Row Records chain that was on Trayvon Lane's neck. That caused an increase in the tension between the Southside Crips and the Mob Piru. Fast forward to September 7th of 1996, there was a fight here in Vegas. It was Mike Tyson versus Bruce Seldon. It was routine for the gangsters from Compton to come up here, both Southside and Mob Piru. In addition, recording artists would show. And so Marion Shug Knight and Tupac Shakur went to the fight, as well as members of the Southside Crips went, and Marion brought his entourage, which involved Mob Piru gang members, including Trayvon Lane. One of the Southside Crips that was present happened to be Orlando Anderson. And as the Tupac Shakur entourage left out the MGM, Mr. Anderson was alone in the elevator bay at the MGM. Mr. Lane notified Mr. Shakur that Orlando Anderson was one of the people who tried to snatch his Death Row Records chain, and Mr. Shakur then attacked Mr. Anderson, as well as the entourage joined in, and there was a giant beatdown of Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson's uncle is Dwayne Keith Davis, who was also present. He is the head of, or was the head of, the Burr Street faction of the Southside Compton Crips. Shortly after Mr. Anderson received his beating at the MGM, Mr. Davis found out about it, and during that, he formulated a plan to exact revenge upon Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur. In furtherance of that, he acquired a .40 caliber Glock firearm from a drug associate that he had. He then along with other members of Southside, loaded up into 2 vehicles and went over to the Club 662, which was a club that was down on East Flamingo, where Tupac Shakur was supposedly going to give a concert later that evening. They remained at that scene for a short period of time, but Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur did not show. They figured that they better get out of there as they were lying in wait for them, and they drove and stopped at a liquor store. When they stopped at a liquor store, Mr. Davis, who was actually originally in the van, decides, I don't want to be in this van anymore because these individuals are not down with what I want to do, which is I want to go and shoot Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight for beating my nephew down in the MGM. And so he gets into the Cadillac and he provides the .40 caliber Glock firearm to one of the two, or to the 2 individuals in the back seat. The driver of that Cadillac was a person by the name of Terrence Bubble Up Brown. The passenger behind the driver was an individual named Big Dre Smith, also known as Freaky, and the right rear passenger was his nephew, Orlando Anderson. They then drove westbound on Flamingo, and as they were heading westbound on Flamingo, they happened to see the caravan that included Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur driving eastbound. There was an order for them to do a U-turn. They did a U-turn. They pulled up next to the vehicle, and the rear passenger fired a number of rounds out of that vehicle, striking Mr. Knight in the head and Mr. Shakur several times, and then the vehicle headed south on Koval. Most of this kind of broad outline of facts was known to police as far back as 1996. What was lacking was admissible evidence to establish this chain of events that occurred that night. In 2018, Mr. Davis began making public statements about his involvement in this crime on a show called Gangster Chronicles. In 2019, Mr. Davis decided to write a book, and an autobiography of his life as the head of the Burris Street, Southside Compton Crips, acknowledging that he was a high-level drug dealer, he was the shot caller, or as he put it, if we were in an army, I was the 5-star general. He admitted within that book that he did acquire the firearm with the intent to go hunt down Mr. Shakur and Mr. Knight. He admitted to being the front right passenger in the white Cadillac, and that he was the on-ground, on-site commander of the effort to kill Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight. Since 2019, he's appeared at least 8 separate times in promotion of this book and repeated various versions of these events, all of which he acknowledges that he is, in fact, the person that ordered the death of Mr. Shakur and the attempted murder of Mr. Knight. And so at this point in time, Judge, the proof is evident, the presumption is great that he is responsible for the murder of Tupac Shakur, and he will be found guilty of murder with use of a deadly weapon with the intent to promote, further, or assist a criminal gang, and I'd ask for a no-bail warrant for his arrest.
Based on those representations, the court finds that proof is evident, presumption great. Warrant will issue with no bail. My notes show that the defendant is not in custody, but you said that he is.
He was picked up by police walking outside his residence this morning.
Okay.
He's going to be booked into the Clark County Detention Center on this warrant. And so 1 week, which should be Wednesday, in front of Judge Jones at 10 o'clock.
Okay.
Or at 8:30 in Department 10.
There's no lower court case that needs to be dismissed, correct?
Correct.
I'm showing 48 exhibits with some 1A is also included. 1A, 1 through 48 plus a 1A. Do you want those all lodged with the court?
Yes, sir.
The exhibits will all be lodged with the clerk of the court. Court orders a pretrial release assessment. Are there any material witness warrants that need to be quashed?
There is one.
All right, we'll give you, you said 1 week on Wednesday next week?
Wednesday of next week.
Okay.
October 4th at 8:30 a.m. in Department 10.
Thank you. Next case.
Yes, yesterday in grand jury case number 22 CGJ 129A and B, the grand jury returned a 2 bill against Fernando Conde and Tanya Carolina Avila charging them with, as it relates to Conde, 5 counts of lewdness with a